It was a small Christian commune, aspired to create a small slice of heaven on earth. But what soon transpired would, to most, ironically for the so-called Jesus Fellowship, look a lot more like hell. Despite the sweet, slightly eclectic exterior and the sense of community harmony, a dark cesspit of depravity was operating just under the surface. What was beneath? One of the most abusive cults in history. And they weren't just in one place, but dotted all over the UK, doing outreach, buying up businesses, and hiding behind the veneer of a good Christian church. And all of it was started and led by a single charismatic guru who seemed to put people in a trance when he spoke. And they got away with it for decades. A ring of abuse that targeted the vulnerable would be hushed, covered up, and suppressed at every opportunity, all on such a massive scale but the police had never seen anything like it before. So, how was such widespread abuse allowed to go on for so long? What can we learn from the people who were there? And how did one man build an army from nothing? To understand how this mild-mannered Christian movement turned into a dangerous and abusive cult, we need to go way back and examine the man who started it all. Noel Stanton was born on Christmas Day 1926, an interesting coincidence, as his future profession as a preacher would prove. He was born in the county of Bedfordshire, left school at 16 to find work, before being conscripted into the Royal Navy during World War II. After his service, sources stated that he bounced around Bedfordshire looking for odd jobs. But Noel was also a godly man and more pious than most, often reportedly joining Christian movements in his local area and preaching to those around him. Eventually he would leave Bedfordshire for Northamptonshire, and specifically the sleepy village of Bugbrook in the western half of the county. It was no different from any tiny parish village at the time, but for Noel, it was the start of a long, dark journey. It would be here in Bugbrook in 1957 where Noel would take up a role as a lay preacher for the Bugbrook Baptist Church. What's a lay preacher? It's the name of a role in the Baptist Union in which a person could take up an informal ministerial role even if not officially ordained. You see, Baptist vicars needed to go through theological training and a rite of ordination. In most churches, this is how someone ends up with the official title of Reverend. Noel didn't have this kind of training, but he was knowledgeable and charismatic enough to take the unofficial role entrusted by the church's congregation. Because that was the other thing that you should know about Noel, he was very charismatic. The way he spoke about God and Jesus captivated people. It captured their attention, and they liked what they saw. Philippa Barnes, who was a member of the group back in the day, stated of Stanton, quote, "You could feel his influence, and that he didn't need to be there to do so." Now, Philippa wasn't there during the earliest years of Bugbrook Baptist Church, which had less than 100 weekly regulars, despite the large swathe of young people who went occasionally. But many among you have already started to have a few red flags go up in your heads in regards to Stanton when you combine his charisma with his religious beliefs. This isn't a new pattern. From Jonestown to Heaven's Gate and more, such movements with charming leaders and a religious background so often turned into sinister cults. But people didn't recognise that pattern at the time, especially in sleepy rural England. To them, it would have appeared innocent enough, just an intense, fiery pastor combined with a Christian counterculture movement. And maybe back then, it was. Especially up until the late 60s, Stanton's preaching was intense and emotive, but distinctly still Baptist in nature. It was likely a lot harder to spot the pattern that we see today. But in 1969, that changed. Stanton announced a new denomination called the Jesus Fellowship. This put some extra distance between Bugbrook and the Baptist Church oversight. It also turned Stanton from just a lay preacher to the leader of a new Christian movement. This was significant for Stanton personally. Reports state that he started the Jesus Fellowship in 1969 because of what he perceived to be a profound and life-changing spiritual experience, which led the energy of his sermons going into overdrive, as well as the embracing of an almost theatrical style of worship. It was high energy, with the laying on hands in sermons, speaking in tongues, dancing in the aisles, and hands reaching high into the air. With his wiry hair and eclectic fashion sense, he didn't seem much like a pastor. But then people heard him preach, and combined with the sheer energy he would bring to his sermons, word quickly spread. In the UK, those of us who are familiar with common Church of England services understand them to be on the generous side, a little belaboured, sedated, and slow. People were used to going to church every Sunday, sitting down, saying the words to get through it all, and then going home. Even Baptist services were considered somewhat similar in this regard, even if in a different denomination. People were leaving the church in droves as Britain slowly became more secular in the 60s and 70s, and what replaced them were counterculture movements, hippies, communes, experimental living situations, free love, disco, and rock and roll. But then appears Stanton, who in comparison to most British church services was borderline erratic at the altar. He was fiery, emotive, and intense. It was involved, it was exciting, it was different. And so it drew a crowd. People who were religious but looking for that slightly different way of living flocked to Bugbrook in their droves as Stanton's audience grew. So much so that there was this kind of universal aura around Stanton. He oozed pastoral charisma. When he spoke, everyone listened. Nobody at the time had seen anything quite like it, and it would all change again in the early 70s. A part of this alternative living that Stanton peddled was a form of communal Christian living, but he had the idea to practice what he preached, and he recommended total commitment to the cause from its followers. So the Jesus Fellowship began to pull its congregation's money together and used it to buy a hall. The new Grade 2 listed farmhouse, Stanton's base of operations, would be called New Creation Hall, and people started to move in. The Jesus Fellowship Commune was born. So, how did the Jesus Fellowship Commune work? And we know a lot about the moment up to this pseudo-separation from the rest of the world, but how did they operate once the farmhouse was actually set up? The organisation had a pyramid structure. At the top was Stanton, perhaps unsurprisingly. Below him was a leadership circle known to many as the Apostolic Team, or the Council of Elders. They acted a bit like a court would around a king, a sounding board to help steer the fellowship. In reality, regardless of discussion, Stanton's word was the final one anyway. They were what's known as the elders in the organisation, which were part of a larger group of spiritually senior men within the church. However, 99% of these were not in Stanton's inner circle and had more of a general communal authority over the members of the various properties that the Jesus Fellowship would eventually encompass. Below the elders were just the regular members of the commune, men, women and children. Men were called brothers and women sisters, not unlike monastic Christian orders do today, but only men were allowed to have any senior leadership role whatsoever. From the top down, it was patriarchal to the core. Members of the community would hand over their assets almost entirely. They would sell their homes and possessions and move into New Creation Hall. Their money from various kinds of employment was pooled in a communal manner and would be redistributed to the organisation's needs. Everyone would eat, and people got to be part of something greater than themselves. From the outside looking in, others around this time could see the appeal. Single mothers looking to bring up children morally, in accordance with the church, settled traditional nuclear families looking to strengthen their faith and live communally, counterculture outcasts who came from a lifestyle of sin. Everyone was welcome, and all came. Children played in large, open grounds. Adults prayed and sung songs. It seemed idyllic. But giving the fellowship everything means literally everything. Even clothes were shared. It was highly utilitarian, but left little room for personal expression. People could not make those decisions for themselves. And yet at that time, people really didn't seem to mind. The strength of Stanton's personality, message, and reputation, combined with some quick success, it drew more people in. They liked Stanton, they liked religion, they liked the feelings of unity, community, and opportunity. John Everett was a member of the Jesus Fellowship before it became a commune, and he seemed to be genuinely shocked at how much happier people seemed to be now they had this organisation in their lives. Quoting here, "I remember a guy called Andy out in the garden. He was doing some weeding, and I remember him singing away to himself while he was doing it." And so that was the first thing that really struck me, just how happy everybody looked. I could feel myself melting. He also explains some of the appeal around the kind of counterculture-driven communal living concept. Quoting again, "I always had these yearnings for a lifestyle that was different to the materialistic lifestyle. This feeling that striving for wealth didn't equate to happiness, and I didn't feel attached to material property in the way that a lot of my friends seemed to be. It would be very easy for the fellowship to draw in so-called lost souls. The Jesus Fellowship gave them purpose, community, company, the idea of striving and contributing to something greater. It's easy to see, especially once it had gotten off the ground, just how appealing that might have been to many at the time. The Fellowship, now hovering somewhere between a cult, a religion, a monarchy, and a communist utopia, flourished financially as their members swelled, enough to purchase several more local buildings. New Creation Hall quickly became New Creation Farm, as the rest of the farm's buildings were purchased and made into communal living spaces, with up to a couple dozen people living in them. The feedback loop was pretty instantaneous. Everyone contributed their wealth, which allowed expansion and recruitment. The new people would bring their own money in too, and before you know it, there were hundreds of people across Northamptonshire who were becoming a part of it, all pooling their resources together. By the 80s, it owned at least 10 country houses in the area, and membership in communal housing was up to 450 people, and they were all contributing, but more than just money. The Jesus Fellowship, using the money, set up various businesses to help bring more money into the organisation. The Jesus Fellowship would work in and run these businesses. It was operating a chain of health food shops, a clothing shop, and even a building supply company. In 1982, the Northampton Chronicle and Echo described it as the new aristocracy of the East Midlands. Such was the financial scale of the operation. These businesses proved profitable in local areas, especially because labour costs were non-existent, and with church-based exemption status for various taxes in Britain, in the end, the church, as it expanded, would be worth tens of millions of pounds. Sounds pretty ideal, right? Well, not exactly. Not all was right and merry at New Creation Hall. In December of 1976, a 26-year-old member of the Jesus Fellowship, David Gavin Hooper, was found dead on the property. His clothes were folded in a pile next to him. The coroner's report by Coroner Michael Colker stated that the death was put down to exposure, but noted that it was extraordinary that he would have gone somewhere without his coat on a morning that cold. This implied, even if it couldn't be proven, that Hooper's death was not at his own hand. Nothing came of it. If someone did cause his death, they completely got away with it to this day. 18 months later, a 19-year-old named Stephen Orchard was found headless on a nearby railway line after telling his parents he was thinking of leaving the fellowship. It has also been reported that there was an argument between Orchard and Stanton that day. It could have been a case of suicide, but Colcott did this report too, and in this case noted concern over 2 mysterious deaths at the fellowship in a relatively short period of time. The verdict for Orchard's death was ultimately left open. Even more concerning was letters the coroner had received from parents in the fellowship. They were worried about their children's safety. Coroner Colcott made this explicitly clear at the 1978 inquest regarding Orchard's death. But for a few reasons, this wasn't followed up on. Firstly, it was the 1970s, and safeguarding systems were basically non-existent in comparison to what they are today. As far as the police were concerned, if there was no formal complaint or accusation, these concerns were not worth assessing. Moreover, the coroner's remit was narrow. It wasn't his job to investigate institutions. As soon as his open verdict was delivered, his role ended. He put all that together, and simply nothing happened in regards to these concerns, which is, we will see later, turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. Had people heeded Colcott's warning, so much suffering could have been averted. And the whole thing left the Jesus Fellowship pretty rattled. The incidents were being reported on by local media outlets. They were being called a New Age Christian cult by people in the area. It would make the group more insular and isolated from the outside, but they rallied around their leader. The church in Stanton always had an excuse for why the media was turning against them. It was either a concerted effort from a disgruntled former member trying to stir up misinformation to make the group look bad, but the Baptist Union was starting to take notice too. By 1986, they voted to expel the fellowship from the Baptist Union altogether, stating it had caused the church embarrassment, that its independence and isolation were concerning, and that it had a poor relationship with other local churches. As such, the church no longer fulfilled a basic core requirement of Baptist churches: governance by the whole congregation. At worst, it was a Stantonian dictatorship, and at best, it was run by the elites within it. Either way, it simply didn't qualify. Stanton may have preached equality in the eyes of God, but within the fellowship, some were more equal than others. This was another blow to the organisation's credibility, and yet its members remained, for the most part, unshakable in their faith towards their communities and their leader. But the fellowship knew it would need new members soon to continue expansion, and the bad press really wasn't helping things. However, as luck would have it, Whilst the local media covered the stories around the fellowship in extensive detail, the national media had barely picked it up. This meant there were plenty of people who the fellowship could still reach. They had to go big. They needed an army, so they made one. And in 1987, a new campaigning wing of the Jesus Fellowship would be launched, the Jesus Army. And they really looked like an army too. Army green bomber jackets with the words love, power, and sacrifice embroidered on the back. And Stanton really leaned into the army gimmick. Community houses were rebranded as battle stations, and a war fund would be where they collected money for their campaigning. The plan to recruit as many new members as possible was known as the Jesus Army War Battle Operations Network, or Jawbone for short. If that wasn't strange enough, then the mission, touted as fighting economic recession, family breakdown, and moral decay, certainly was. The Jesus Army would load themselves into colourful double-decker buses with the Jesus Army branding on them, and then they would tour around the country. The work was part campaigning, part charity, part missionary work. The usually younger members of the fellowship would be sent to seek out lost souls like the homeless and drug addicts. They would offer them a place to stay for the night in one of their communal houses in the local area. In the newest areas, there might be just one that the fellowship bought or rented specifically to use as a beachhead and operating base within the city. This outreach was highly effective for the following reasons. Reason number one, the National Good Press drove up recruitment numbers and helped clean up the reputation of the organisation. Homelessness in Britain had doubled between 1979 and 1986, driven by rising unemployment, government cuts, and high inflation. It was tough times for a lot of people, and the Jesus Army genuinely did a lot of good in helping out those who were struggling. Reason number two, it allowed them to establish themselves in cities across the UK as far apart as London and Liverpool. This spread their message countrywide, which was also good for recruitment, and allowed them to build out a network of a few communal houses that all connected back to Bugbrook. And reason number three, converting someone from living on the street to a communal housing system where they can get back on their feet garnered loyalty amongst those few who did choose to stick around. But again, this has a sickly sheen to it, because these struggling folk, who the Jesus Army were giving a room for the night, were staying in dormitory-style rooms for sleeping with teenagers, even children as young as 12. And those who went on Jesus Army raids, as we may call them, were often given quotas of people to try and help, recruit, or talk to. That put young people in a pretty scary spot, being essentially forced to engage with people that they didn't know. The whole thing would never pass safeguarding today, but in the 80s, it was still limited. These weren't formal quotas, there was no consequence for not reaching them, but that internal pressure and psychological effect would have been apparent to many. This didn't seem to do anything negative for the fellowship's PR, though. The Jesus Army was a massive success. It turned the organisation, for a time, into a household name with national recognition in a lot of the country. From the late 80s, the Jesus Army were regularly found at the Glastonbury Music Festival, and this seemingly anti-capitalist version of Christianity, dedicated to helping vulnerable people, just fit right in. They were able to tap into the youth of the day to garner even more recruits, and they proved to be flexible salesmen. In the 90s, the rave scene was big, so the Jesus Army sent people out into nightclubs and started raves of its own too. It all helped bring in more people and more cash. Sure, most people viewed them with a lot of suspicion, but there would always be a small minority sympathetic to the cause and looking for a fresh start. By the 2000s, they professionalized the practice, opening distinct Jesus centers, which did the same thing as the communal houses did in helping the vulnerable off the streets for a short while, but with a more charity-faced appearance, with cafes, showers, advice desks, and more. The principle was the same: meet needs at the door and draw people in from there. They had over 3,500 people all contributing to the organisation by this point, with up to 75 communal houses across the country. And if that was where it all ended, that would be fine. A bit of a kooky religious bunch who helped out the homeless and had a communal living thing going on. No real problem there. But that wasn't where it ended. Because underneath it all, this moral Christian institution had a dark secret. For over 4 decades worth of history about this organisation that we've covered, we've been dancing around a very important and very serious part of the story. We've alluded to it a few times now, but we wanted to cover it all together in some detail because there's an awful lot of it, and that is the systemic abuse that people, particularly children, suffered at the hands of members of the Jesus Army, including, allegedly, Noel Stanton himself. It could only ever end one way. There are plenty of reasons that a person, and especially a young person, found living in the Jesus Fellowship utterly miserable. The first one could be the fellowship's draconian rules, things that were considered worldly by Stanton were deemed unacceptable. This meant various creature comforts were outright banned, although what was banned also changed on a whim. The list at some stage included secular TV, pop music, makeup, sporting events, restaurants, buffets, weight training, holidays, zoos, coffee, sunbathing, celebrating Christmas, swimming, quote, for pleasure, and crisps. Someone like John Everett stated that these sacrifices needed to be made because, quote, any kind of entertainment was wrong, so no more cinema, no more television, and from now on, I would have to stop listening to any music. Children were not even allowed toys, and confused children were unhappy when they found out their parents sold all their toys in order for them to become a part of the fellowship. These kinds of rules are meant for one purpose: manipulation and control. The less someone has to their name, the more likely they are to depend on the cult to find meaning in something. Cameras were also banned, but the reason behind this was likely far darker and more sickening. No cameras would mean evidence would be much harder to come by and could cover up the substantial abuse that went on for not just years, but decades. Such psychological tactics were present in other ways as well. Between vows of life commitment and the almost total separation of parents from their children in some cases meant that slowly Stanton could gain a foothold over members' entire lives. Think about it. The organization had their friends, their family, their money, their jobs, their purpose, and their community. It doesn't leave much for anyone or anything else. Philippa Barnes, the survivor we mentioned before, was harshly chastised among other members because she had gotten a haircut in town with 10 quid that her grandmother had given to her as a gift. She said, quote, I could feel that rebellion inside me. Like, what does it really matter? It's just hair. Because even that kind of freedom of expression was a sign of a person's autonomy. The fellowship wanted to take that away, even to the extent of giving certain members virtue names, different from their own, which would define them, further separating them from any life they had before joining the group. The names were said to reflect members' most valued qualities. Such names included valiant, zealous, forthright, or in one young woman's case, submission. Remember Stephen Orchard, the train track victim who wanted to leave? His virtue name was faithful. The needs of the church was seen as, above all, far above the needs of any individual. For those who did leave, they would be totally shunned, which would mean a person faced substantial risks trying to rebuild their lives once they left. Another cultish behaviour showing the sheer emotional control on display was that members were banned from communicating in any way with shunned former members, to the extent that songs were sung at worship sessions telling the stories of their betrayal. John Everett, the former member we mentioned, was one such individual. Stanton gradually severed members' attachments to the rest of society, replacing it with a single focus point: the fellowship. And the more uncertain one is of the outside, the more they are likely to drive deeper into the organization to find comfort in familiarity. This is the nature of cults, and this kind of change happens in a person slowly over time. You can't always see a storm when you're in it, especially when you're a kid who's grown up in it and it's all you've ever known. Local children of the fellowship were picked on and avoided at school, so they stuck together. They weren't allowed to eat school dinners, so every lunchtime would be spent in a nearby fellowship house. There was very little chance of making friends. Even the family unit was separated to drive people further into the cult. Teenagers and children were removed from their parents' oversight for the most part. The sexes were also separated along gender lines, taking husbands and wives away from each other for long periods of the day. The focus was on the communal aspect, breaking up the biological family in exchange for the one that Stanton had created. To justify the practice, he would point to a passage from Matthew 10 in which Jesus said, I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother. A man's enemies will be members of his own household. The other thing to note was that celibacy was preached strongly by Stanton, further separating couples through lack of physical intimacy. It was seen as the ultimate ideal for men in the fellowship. Female members would be blamed for this, being told they were sinful and distracting the men from worship. Survivors and commentators have suggested that this lack of intimacy may have also had darker consequences. By removing healthy outlets for affection, the fellowship created an environment where sexual dysfunction could take root, and in hindsight, some believe this contributed to the patterns of sexual abuse that later emerged. Stanton himself stated he wanted members to give our genitals to Jesus, a very cruel concept considering what many within the organization would later be accused of. And of course, parents not seeing their children for large sections of the day was hugely problematic for reasons that we'll go into shortly, which was what spawned a lot of the original concerns sent to Coroner Colquitt. Women suffered a lot as they were barred from rising to any position of authority, seen as totally subordinate to men within the organisation. For example, if a man was driving in a car, a woman was expected to sit in the back. Such social pressures also contributed to the rotten environment inside the fellowship. It eventually turned from a collective commune of people pooling resources and working together to a manipulative and controlling environment for those at the bottom of the society's hierarchy. And those deepest at the very bottom were children. Children are known to misbehave, act out, and test boundaries. It's what they do. But any insubordinate behaviour among them at the fellowship would see strict punishment, mainly the rod. Rodding was a corporal punishment referred to by the organisation as a loving form of correction, in which children were beaten with thin implements like little metal rods, birch branches, or canes in order to teach obedience and break a child's will early in life. But this kind of discipline wasn't to be solely administered by parents, although it was often as a form of social pressure among adults to be seen as handling their kids' behaviour. Parents weren't around all the time by design, and so often the beatings would be deferred to the house elder as the leading authority in the immediate vicinity. Children were beaten, and sometimes their parents had no idea that it happened. Not even toddlers and infants were spared this wrath. One survivor's testimony from a BBC documentary on the group stated that, quote, "I was beaten with a stick from the age of 2. I was rodded every day." John, when interviewed, tells a chilling story, quote, "A young child was taken away from the dining room table to be disciplined, and we could all hear his screams as he was hit. And on that occasion, he was hit at least 6 times, and it was just horrible. It was humiliating for the child, it was humiliating for everyone. Horrible." What did Stanton say about all this, though? Well, that old quote from Proverbs, "He who spares the rod spoils the child." The practice continued for decades. Children who simply would not comply or did something that the church saw as really bad, they would assume the devil was inside them and perform exorcisms on them in order to get it out. But we don't really know many details about how they were conducted. And now we need to talk about the elephant in the room: sexual abuse. At the fellowship, this was an endemic phenomenon. There are so many stories, many coming from victim testimony, which prove just how widespread it was. Remember Philippa Barnes, the survivor we have been quoting on and off throughout this video? Well, when she was about 13, an adult member of the fellowship started acting differently around her. He would stare at her intently in meetings and follow her home on his motorbike. Soon he was sending her love letters and telling her that they should get married. I'll repeat, she was just 13 at the time. Her stalker's attention would have been patently obvious to other adults around the time, but nobody spoke up, and he went on unchallenged. To protect herself, she had to ask a friend's brother to say they were together, despite the ban on flirting and dating. It's unknown whether the stalking ever ended before Philippa and her family left the group. But that's not her only story. A friend of Philippa's, who to this day is anonymous, had to go to the police because she was sexually assaulted by an elder. Her family left the community shortly afterwards, which prompted Philippa to act. She'd been asked by this elder to keep watch as the 24-year-old abused her friend in the basement. She believed it wasn't her story to tell, but when her friend went to the police, she knew that she had to help corroborate her friend's true account. So she told her father, who went to the house's elder, who then informed Stanton. The alleged perpetrator was questioned by Stanton but claimed that the girls were lying. So Stanton then accused Philippa and her friend of being in cahoots together in order to ruin the man's life. The fellowship wanted to deal with the matter internally, which was their way of saying they wanted to brush it under the carpet, but Philippa's and her father chose to go over the heads of the elders and Stanton himself to contact the police about her corroboration. She would later go and testify bravely in court about what she knew her friend had experienced. When she arrived, other Jesus Fellowship members were there. They were present solely to support the accused. Her family stood by her. Her testimony led to the first conviction within the church for a child sex crime, with the perpetrator being found guilty of 2 counts of sexual assault of a minor. But the judge only jailed the man for a mere 3 months. The judge's mitigating circumstances was that the offence had taken place years earlier, and that the man may have struggled under the church's strict regime of celibacy, no dating, and gender segregation. The punishment simply didn't fit the crime, but it worked to the church's advantage. He was only gone for a short time. Few outside of the house he was in even knew he'd been convicted. When released, he was welcomed back with open arms to the community. Philippa and her family was still there. She was shunned and ostracized by the worst out of everyone in the family. She stated what that was like: young women like her, seen as traitors by the wider group, were openly called Jezebels, a biblical name for an immoral woman who deceives people for her own gain. She went on to quote, "You're belittled at every opportunity by Noel. So who's going to believe that? A man, an elder, has done those things to somebody?" Many survivors who kept their own stories quiet stated the fear of Noel's authority was why they didn't speak up. The cage had been slammed, shut, and locked, only for innocent children to turn around and realise that animals were put in his side with them. And there were plenty of other horror stories too. As late as 2010, a volunteer gardener was described by a judge as a relentless pedophile who terrorised young boys whilst living in the fellowship during the late 90s. He was found guilty on 3 counts of indecent assault. The man had previous child sexual abuse convictions, and it became clear in the course of the investigation that the fellowship had not been conducting proper background checks. One survivor likened the organisation to a sweet shop for child abusers, perfectly coordinated to allow predators free rein across the organisation. A report by the Jesus Fellowship Community Trust, JFCT, a group tasked with winding up the church's affairs in the late 2010s, found that a deeply horrifying 1 in 6 children involved with the fellowship was estimated to have been sexually abused by the cult. There's potentially hundreds of children who suffered, forced to live with or nearby their abusers for years, if not decades. It is sickening, especially when you know about the cycle of sexual abuse in children, as some could have gone to abuse others decades after it happened to them. But there's a reason we know all of this information. It's because the Jesus Fellowship eventually folded under police investigation, but not before such abuse had been allowed to go on for so long. If concerns and warnings were heeded sooner, a lot of people would have been spared an awful fate. But it all had to end sometime, and for an organisation ruled exclusively by one man for half a century, it was never going to end any other way. Stanton died in 2009 at the age of 82. Many didn't see him in his last moments, but he was apparently weak, old, and frail. It was at this point that more senior leaders took over many of the church's operations as he grew more and more distant from public life. There's no official report of what he died of. Some sources state an unidentified illness took up his last several months on this earth, but there's little else. If insiders know the specifics, they didn't go on the record with it, at least not yet. His legacy endured for a decade. His funeral procession attracted huge crowds onto the streets of Northampton, where screens beamed out footage of his fire and brimstone baptism as people theatrically wept. We were in the Jesus Centre era by this point, and despite everything going on in the background, and because barely anybody knew about it, Stanton and the Fellowship was still wildly popular. The Council of Elders, 5 apostolic leaders, would continue to run the day-to-day church operations as they had prior to Stanton's death. But they knew they needed to do something to get out in front of the abuse allegations that they knew existed within the fellowship. It began internally, with them asking members to come forward and share their stories of abuse with the church. This way, those who wanted to come forward could. They had a record on what people were being accused of, and they could attempt to deal with the matter in-house. This isn't that strange on the surface. That year, the Methodist Church did the exact same thing. But what was strange was the sheer number of people who came forward. They gathered and kept a file with all the testimony in it. A year later, now in the relatively contemporary time of late 2014, safeguarding had come up to the standards that we see for the most part today. And after police received 2 safeguarding referrals in quick succession that highlighted concern for children's welfare, so they went over to discuss this with the group's leadership, fully unaware of what they were about to find. 2 of these referrals, this close together, raised a red flag for Detective Inspector Ali White, so he went as well. At the meeting, he spotted the file, a thick stack of 133 pages worth of testimony and accusations. Flicking through, White was shocked by what he saw. The papers contained allegations of everything from emotional abuse to serial sexual abuse. He remembered thinking to himself, quote, "That's a crime, that's a crime, that's a rape, that's another crime." The scale of abuse was so widespread, he'd never seen anything like it. He told the leadership the police would need to take performance back to the station, and the elders agreed. In early 2015, Northamptonshire Police would launch Operation Lifeboat to uncover the truth and bring as many perpetrators to justice as possible. The Fellowship was starting to sweat. That same year, the Fellowship commissioned an independent review into its safeguarding practices, but they continued to blame a few bad apples for such concerns, as opposed to a wider pattern of coercion and abuse. They needed to look like they were doing something, but as Detective Constable Mark Albright, who worked the case, noted, their efforts fell far short Quote, "The culture was a recipe for disaster. The accused was pretty much asked to say sorry to the person, and then that was that." Albright's impression was that some of the leadership wanted to root out the issue once and for all, but others had selective memories about the process. In reality, they may have been protecting themselves or someone they knew who were in on it all. But this wasn't simply a case of a few bad apples. It was a whole rotten orchard. Of those accused included 162 former elders who had authority over and access to vulnerable children almost around the clock. It was a 1 in 6 chance if you were a child there. The same odds as a die landing on a specific number, or perhaps more fittingly, Russian roulette. As rumours started to become more widespread, the same question was on everyone's mind. Did Stanton know? And to keep it brief, yes, he knew, and he did a lot more than that, at least according to some accusations made against him by the 133-page testimony dossier. In 2017, leaders were finally forced to acknowledge at the church's annual general meeting that there were, quote, serious allegations against the late Stanton of financial, spiritual, and sexual abuse. People didn't want to believe it, but it was, of course, true. It forced everyone to reevaluate their entire relationship with the fellowship up to that point, even if their experiences didn't personally mirror what so many survivors were going through. Some were defiant in their denial. Others broke down at the thought that they had contributed to pure evil. A few left for other churches quietly, and Northamptonshire police had to track them down to see if their safeguarding requirements were there too. But the police ran into trouble with its investigation. Some victims couldn't be traced. Many who left the church didn't even have bank accounts or a credit history that the police could look at. They were ghosts, and they simply vanished elsewhere. Others denied their allegations or didn't want police action to be taken, worried about what opening up old wounds might do. In total, only 5 people were convicted as part of Operation Lifeboat. The details of those convictions in particular were disturbing. 4 of the 5 perpetrators had targeted children under the age of 16, and several were shown to be prolific in the horror they subjected on others. After the 2017 Stanton accusations, those who were running the fellowship stepped down, pending an independent investigation into their handling of abuse allegations. The reality was that they were likely complicit and may have withheld evidence, which was partially why Operation Lifeboat only convicted 5 of the most egregious cases. But the police, nor anybody else, has the evidence to prove it, especially for crimes that sometimes took place decades in the past. In 2017, Philippa set up a Facebook group for those who used to be part of the fellowship, hoping to catch up with people who used to know and share stories of their time there. It gained a lot of popularity from former members, but soon the stories started to come out, dozens and dozens of them. Philippa then launched the Jesus Fellowship Survivors Association the following year, aiming to expose the truth about the church, support survivors, and get justice for those who'd been abused. People were angry. They wanted justice for what was done because so many, especially Stanton, completely got away with it. There were so many allegations of rampant physical, sexual, and emotional abuse that Philippa and a few other group members had to set up a spreadsheet to keep track of them all. Operation Lifeboat had barely scratched the surface. A solicitor suggested to the group that a redress scheme might be worthwhile. The fellowship was worth around £58 million at the time, and such a scheme could see the victims be compensated by the organisation that had wronged them. It wasn't about the money, but such compensation could be claimed without having to pursue a criminal case, which suited many victims and still gave them the closure that what happened to them shouldn't have. It allowed them emotionally and financially to move on from it all. The bombshell about the accusations had soon hit the media too, and people were leaving the fellowship in droves. With fewer than 1,000 people and a rapidly aging population, the group's finances were taking a walloping. By 2019, at the recommendation of the church's leadership team, the fellowship's members voted to revoke the church's constitution, to shut the church down, wind down operations, complete accounts, and dissolve. The house of cards Stanton had built was rubble now. One senior leader told the BBC in their recent documentary that there was a growing feeling that the fellowship was too broken to fix. And so on that day, May 26, 2019, the Jesus Fellowship and the Jesus Army was no more. With the disbandment, though, they noted that they would participate in the redress scheme. But that wasn't quite the end of things. People were still out there who needed to be compensated or investigated. The redress scheme had to spend several years getting set up, and people had to deal with the trauma of what they'd been through, some for almost their entire lives up to that point. The redress scheme was officially launched in 2022, where former members could apply for compensation for emotional, physical, or sexual abuse by submitting a statement via a solicitor. The involvement of the Survivors Association was crucial in getting the word out to others. Claimants could also apply for a Community Adverse Experiences payment, which did not require a solicitor's input. This was to show that this wasn't just about individual cases, but a long-standing pattern of systemic abuse. It also offered closure to others psychologically affected by the fellowship, but who didn't quite meet the threshold for abuse, or for those who didn't want to get a solicitor involved, or for those who simply couldn't afford one. Of the applicants to the scheme, 96% received some form of redress, but having to make statements about what had happened to them was bruising for many. And even though it's not about the money didn't appear to really be appropriate compensation either. People received between £2,000 and £50,000 in compensation. That was, apparently, what a lifetime of trauma and fear was worth. Especially with the vast wealth of the fellowship, it seemed pretty low, but of course, we don't know how much of the church's finances being tied up in a somewhat protected status affected things. And even if the fellowship claimed that they would help with the redress scheme, their word meant nothing, and they could have fought it the whole way to ensure as little compensation as possible. The scheme's final report that was published in late 2024 staggered people when it revealed how deep the scale of the depravity really was. A total of 264 alleged abusers were reported as being in the fellowship during its operation, more than half of whom were leaders. And to be honest, considering some victims couldn't be found and some crimes likely were never discovered in the investigation, the true number could be way higher. Over 30 allegations related to Stanton himself, who was a unique kind of monster in his own right. The report stated that harm and abuse were not limited to a handful of leaders, a particular period of time, or geographical locations. It was widespread and systematic. And it's important that this was pointed out. Separating the family unit, denying social interaction, treating women as subordinates rather than equals, and many more of Stanton's neurotic rules contributed heavily to the culture of abuse that grew after they were instigated. Similarly, their total failure to believe or listen to victims, heed warnings, listen to complaints, or even put the most basic of safeguarding procedures in place reflected even worse on the fellowship. People knew what was going on, and they either helped it happen or did nothing. These days, we're used to seeing the clear red flags of cults all over the place, and the Jesus Fellowship really followed a lot of very stereotypical cultish archetypes. A charismatic leader who ruled with absolute authority, isolated from wider society, strange rules that inhibited personal freedoms, psychological tactics that got people to fall further into dependency, and above all, a culture of secrecy, manipulation, coercion, and control that allowed abusers to run rampant throughout the organization with very few repercussions for most. And so you see the Jesus Army and you think, how didn't they know it was a cult? Why didn't they see the red flags like we can among newer cults today? Well, John Everett, the formerly shunned member of the fellowship, stated in his book War and Defeat that, quote, "It would have taken a huge amount of self-deceit to deny that I could plainly see the key characteristics of a cult were in our DNA." So why did so many join up? Some maybe just didn't know any better, maybe some thought the stories were overblown by outsiders, and maybe some were just in denial. Cults are always going to attract a certain kind of person, no matter how switched on they may seem. This is why those who have been in them need to know what to look for, because they are more susceptible to getting caught in one again in the future. For many, it was the contradictions which showed them the reality. It was a utilitarian commune ruled by a single man who imposed his draconian rules. One that preached honesty but hid evidence and covered up decades of abuse. One that called itself peaceful, but named one of its wings an army while beating children daily. One that promoted the church family, but shunned members who didn't toe the party line. One that extolled celibacy and self-control with a leadership team that made no effort to stop their perverse urges. I'm afraid there's no good or satisfying ending to this story. Stanton, although his legacy is ashes now, never faced consequences for the immense amount of suffering he caused either directly at his hand or indirectly through the cult that he built. He got away with it. For decades, he simply got away with it. To date, only 12 former members of the Jesus Fellowship have been convicted for indecent assaults or other offences. Out of the 264 allegedly accused in the redress scheme's final report, that is a conviction rate of just 4.5%. The scheme itself did what it could, but likely didn't and couldn't drastically change anyone's life after the fact, financially or psychologically. Children born and raised in the army now had to face the real world with very little to their names, having to abandon the only kind of life they had ever seriously known and deprogram themselves from the cult they'd been in all their lives. A long and difficult process. Victims have therapy sessions but struggle to sleep. Many abusers got away with what they did, or there simply wasn't enough evidence for a criminal case to be brought against them. They slipped back into public life, whilst victims were left afraid and with little sense of justice or substantial closure. And it's even more painful to know that the whole thing could have been avoided if the deaths of Hooper and Orchard were investigated more closely, if the coroner's concerns from parents had been looked into, if those within the fellowship took the accusations more seriously. Then so much suffering going on even today from decades before could have been prevented, but they didn't. And then other views from former fellowship members muddy the waters. Some of the fellowship's congregation continue to operate as independent churches, but there are many who look back on the fellowship fondly. Facebook groups like Jesus Army, The Good Times, and Jesus People Alumni swap stories and old photos from back in the day. 5 out of 6 children in the fellowship were not abused and had everything from banal to actively enjoyable experiences. So some grew to even genuinely miss it once it dissolved, whilst others argue that the Jesus Army's outreach work and Jesus Centres generally did a lot of good. But despite that, you can't ignore what happened here. On this farm, in these buildings, in this village, this county, and cities across the country, there was a whole network of abuse and cover-ups. And you like to think that it forces those with nostalgia to look at the church so much differently, now with the added context of what was going on at the time and knowing that for much of their lives they were being lied to. But the one good thing that we can say about the Jesus Army is that it was defeated, and through learning some of society's hardest lessons along the way, the plight of the victims will inspire others to bravely speak out about things that they've seen or experienced in other settings in life. Their stories and courage are an inspiration. And no matter how powerful the Jesus Fellowship was, it couldn't take that courage away.